Welcome back to Hardball. Today, we take it for granted that any compelling testimony or game-changing speech made here in Washington will be available to us, if not instantly, then soon, because over the past 30-plus years, some Washington dramas have drawn us in with an almost soap opera-type quality, compelling millions of people to tune in daily. Take this iconic moment from John Dean's testimony in the heat of Watergate.
I began by telling the president that there was a cancer growing on the presidency, and that if the cancer was not removed, the president himself would be killed by it. I also told him that it was important that this cancer be removed immediately because it was growing more deadly every day.
Well, that cooked Nixon's goose. Here's Oliver North, looking clean-cut in full-dress uniform, who testified in the Iran-Contra scandal, and he got 5 times the viewership of the top-rated soap opera General Hospital that day. This is how many people were watching this guy put on this show, thanks to the genius lawyering of Brendan Sullivan. Let's watch this one.
Do you solemnly swear that in the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? I do. Please be seated.
And then after Anita Hill surfaced in the Clarence Thomas confirmation, the country was riveted by the Senate Judiciary Committee hearing. 40 million people watched this.
Environment. This is a circus. It's a national disgrace. And from my standpoint, as a black American, as far as I'm concerned, it is a high-tech lynching for uppity blacks who in any way deign to think for themselves, to do for themselves, to have different ideas. And it is a message that unless you kowtow to an old order, this is what will happen to you.
What a chilling moment. Now listen to this one. It all began the first time we saw television do it. You're looking at it right now. The Army McCarthy hearings, 20 million people watched that back in the early 50s. They could watch politics in real time for the first time. The Army McCarthy hearings that brought down Joe McCarthy in 54. The senator from Wisconsin was being totally irresponsible, calling people communists and communist sympathizers, using guilt by association and every trick in the book to make people look like traitors. Here he is. Watch this scene that killed this guy.
Have you no sense of decency, sir? At long last, have you left no sense of decency?
Well, here we are with Robert Shogan, who wrote the great book about this. Robert Shogan's book, he's with us right now. No sense of decency, sir. You've covered this story. Television, ABC News covered that and created itself that day, right?
Well, that's right, because the other two networks were too busy showing and too profitable showing soap operas. That was one of the things that one of the reasons ABC did it is because they didn't have the soap operas. But it did put them on the journalistic map and made them close to equal with the other two.
David Corn, you've covered a lot of these spectacles yourself at your young age. And the fact is, the McCarthy hearings, I used to come home in the afternoon, and my mom never watched television. Now, this is from an Irish Catholic point of view. It was somewhat different tradition. And those hearings were on every day. I knew who she was rooting for, Joe McCarthy. But a lot of Americans saw what they saw, what Bob was writing about, Robert Shogan, and they said that was the first time they saw something on television that really turned them off and said, this guy's a demagogue. He's a sweaty, dangerous, perhaps drunken, bad guy.
Television is a medium of impressions. You probably know that better than anyone else. It's not so much always what's said, but how it's said. And Joe McCarthy had really, I think, captured the American imagination for years, both good and bad, with his reckless allegations. But he had his fans and he had his detractors. And a lot of it was based on what they saw in newsreels or what they read. People actually read about things back then. But that one moment, that one exchange, it was very personal, seemed to cut through and show the exact type of person he was. Perhaps like we saw with Kennedy and Nixon in the debates. There's some defining moments when you have an image and you sort of see what's there. And that was one of the first times I think it happened in a collective sense nationally.
Let me read something from your book. The fear that permeated the McCarthy era that you wrote about. Here's an excerpt from your book, No Sense of Decency. The politics of fear and paranoia, while they've ebbed and flowed, never really went away. They persist to this day in the midst of the so-called war on terror. McCarthy was able to convince everybody that anybody who opposed the administration at that time, the government, was dangerous.
That's right. Not just to oppose the administration, who opposed him. Well, that's right, and that was paranoia. But let's be clear about this. You know, there's paranoia in itself is not necessarily bad. It can energize things. You need some selective paranoia. For instance, this week, though people didn't hardly notice, it was the 20th anniversary of the Exxon Valdez oil spill. Now, where is the paranoia about the poisoning of our water and our air? People have forgotten that, or it's been obscured. Just as in McCarthy's day, the FBI investigated communists and ignored organized crime. Hoover said it did.
He didn't say. He said there was no such thing as the mafia.
He said there was no such thing, which saved him the trouble from looking into it. Just as today, instead of looking into the destruction of the environment or the destruction of our financial structure, people are absorbed with terrorism. Now, there's a real threat to terrorism, but it needs to be evaluated in a calm and democratic way.
But it was very hard after watching the World Trade Towers,
right,
and the people jumping off the roof at 100 floors. The hellish situation they were in is unimaginable. Yes. I think about it occasionally. We all do. Once you saw that picture, any president could have come forward and said, "We got to get the enemy," and he would have, or she would have in her power, the power to say, "That's the enemy." And this president we just had, George W. Bush, was able to say, because of that anger, Iraq.
Right.
Sick him. And because he was able to do that, we all acted like we were trained to do that.
Well, I mean, I read Robert's book, and it's a good read. But, you know, the parallel that was obvious was that there were a lot of reporters back then covering McCarthy and taking his allegations, more or less his handouts, and just transmitting them without doing any of the evaluative work that you would do to sort of judge whether he was saying, where's the evidence? And it did remind me of those months. You were there, you remember, when reporters were taking what the Bush administration had to say about the threat from Iraq and just putting it out there and not going to alternative sources and not really vetting it because there was that atmosphere of fear and insecurity.
Well, that's right. But let's not just blame the media alone, although I'm happy to do it at times, but it's the people, the politicians who manipulate the media. David mentioned the image, the very powerful image of the towers falling, which the network showed time and time again. But here's an image that the administration wouldn't allow people to see. Those were the coffins of the men coming back from Iraq.
Right. You know your TV. Thank you, Robert Shogan, a neighbor of mine. No Sense of Decency. Get it at the bookstore this week, and it'll tell you about a whole era that preceded this one. I'll tell you where we came from. A great book.